In this video, I'm going to be discussing very briefly the minor prophets. These are the other prophetic books that we have not looked at yet, and they are actually the majority of the books in the prophets, but they are short, hence the name minor prophets. And I talked about them a little bit in an earlier video, but I want to deal with them a bit more here and go into a little more detail on some of them. We're not going to go through all of them because that would take a long time and it'd be a lot for you to try to remember. But some of the more important ones I do want to give you some more information on. Now, first thing to say about the minor prophets, and I think I mentioned this in an earlier video too, is that that's kind of a deceptive name. It's not that they were less important than the major prophets. Some of them may have been far more important in their own times than the major prophets. What that simply means is that their books are shorter. It means fewer of their oracles were preserved. Maybe they delivered a lot more of them, but only a small number were preserved, or maybe they just didn't give as many. But these are shorter books. The longer ones are Hosea. Zechariah is the longest. It's got 14 chapters. Most of them are on the order of 5 chapters or so, 5-6 chapters. And there are 12 of them. So sometimes these books are called the Minor Prophets, sometimes they're called the Book of the 12. And Book of the 12 is something you'll hear among certain scholars. It actually reflects a particular understanding of how these books were formed. The Book of the 12 is the idea that these 12 books were actually, at some point in their history, were edited together and kind of treated as a single book that was written by a number of different authors. And there is some evidence to support this. In some of the early canon lists that we find from the Second Temple period in writers like Josephus, when he's recounting the number of books in the Hebrew Bible, he comes up with 22, which we actually number it at 39. And it's not that he's including fewer books, it's the way he divides them. So some books that we divide, like 1st and 2nd Samuel, he treated as one book. Ezra and Nehemiah were considered a single book. And then also the 12 prophets, the 12 minor prophets, were treated as a single book. We also find in some early manuscripts that they were all contained on a single scroll, so they were treated as a single book. And then there are other scholars who also believe that they find evidence of editing across one book to another. In particular, James Nagalski, who was one of my professors at Baylor, has written a lot on this, that at the ends of certain books and the beginnings of others, we find catchwords, terminology that is shared that he believes evidence that these books were read together, they were edited together, and someone was trying to make connections between them. That's far deeper than we want to get in this class, but just to know that those are discussions that are out there. So you will sometimes hear these referred to as the Book of the 12, sometimes as the Minor Prophet. Is the same. And I believe in an earlier, one of the PowerPoints from last week, I listed those out for you. I'm not going to expect you to list out all 12 of these books or anything on a test, but just be familiar with them. But I do want to focus on some of them in particular. Now, the books are arranged in a roughly chronological order. Now, there's some question about that. Joel, for example, is one of the earlier books. We don't really know when Joel lived. There's nothing in the book that indicates when he lived, and some scholars date it quite late. Others are attributed to an early author, but may have been, or to an early figure, but may have been written later. So, for example, the book of Jonah. Jonah was a prophet in the 8th century, but the book may not have been written at that time. It may have been written much later from stories about Jonah that had been preserved. And Jonah is also kind of unusual for the minor prophets in that it is not a collection of oracles. It's a story. It's a narrative. So it's more like the pre-classical prophets in that sense. But they're roughly in a chronological order from Hosea in the 8th century down to Malachi in the 5th century. Um, so let's look at some of the major books here. I do not have a PowerPoint for these, unfortunately, but I'll kind of walk you through kind of the main points of some of the larger books, or the ones that I want you to pay special attention to. Also, make sure you've done the reading for this week. All of the prophets that I want you to know anything about for test purposes are in the reading. So we start with Hosea. Now, Hosea is an 8th century prophet from the northern kingdom, from Israel. And one of the things the thing that is most notable about Hosea is that his prophecies are, in a sense, acted out through his life. What stands out about Hosea is that he's instructed by God to marry a promiscuous woman. Now, some translations will say prostitute. We don't know for sure if she was a prostitute. The Hebrew word is eshet zonah. A zonah can be a prostitute and often is, but it may simply mean that she was promiscuous. We just don't know if she got paid necessarily. She's a woman with a bad reputation. He's instructed to marry her. Her name is Gomer. And sort of with the expectation that she's going to continue her promiscuous ways. She's going to be unfaithful to Hosea. Now, why would God give such a strange command to one of his prophets? It's a symbolic relationship. And we see this through their children. There are 3 children born to Gomer. The first is named Jezreel. Now, Jezreel is the name of a valley in northern Israel. It's known by a few other names, sometimes the Valley of Megiddo or the Valley of Armageddon. It's this valley in northern Israel. And it's a famous battlefield. And so like in the book of Revelation, Armageddon is where the final battle is fought. But in the Old Testament, it was also the site of a number of battles. Among them was the battle between 2 competing dynasties in the northern kingdom. So the Omrides was the kings Omri, Ahab, and so forth. Jezebel was included in that dynasty. That dynasty was overthrown by a usurper named Jehu, and Jehu fought against the supporters of the Omrides in the Jezreel Valley. And so this child is born and is named Jezreel to signify the end of the dynasty of Jehu, that the blood that they shed at Jezreel will come back on them, and now they're going to be killed, and they're going to lose power. So the child is symbolic. The next 2 children are even more telling as far as the theme of this book goes. So the next 2 children are named Lo Ruhamim, which means no mercy or no compassion, no forgiveness. And then God says, because I will no longer have mercy, I will no longer have compassion on the house of Israel. And then the 3rd child is named Lo-Ami. Lo-Ami means not my people. And so God says, you are not my people, and I am not your God. Now, this is a reversal. This is a couple things. First of all, it's a reversal of what we find in the book of Exodus, where God says to Israel, if you will obey these commands, you will be my people, and I will be your God. It is also the language that's used in marriages and divorces. So in a marriage, the husband would say to the wife, you are my wife, I am your husband. That's how that was their version of I do. And likewise in a divorce, it was the reverse. They would say, you are not my wife, I am not your husband. And that was a divorce. Here, God is divorcing Israel. So we have a metaphor here. The metaphor is that Israel is like God's wife. And just as Gomer is an unfaithful wife, she leaves, she runs away, cheats on Hosea, so also Israel has done that to God through worshiping other gods. So the main theme of this book is Israel's unfaithfulness to God, their idolatry, their worship of other gods. So they're treated like they're in a marriage relationship. This is about the covenant. That just as a marriage is a covenant, so Israel's relationship with God is a covenant, and they have broken that covenant by being unfaithful to God and worshiping other gods. On the other hand, so you get this this symbolism, Hosea's relationship with Gomer, and so Gomer cheats on Hosea just like Israel has cheated on God. But this book is not entirely condemnation, because just as soon as God has divorced Israel, we find he orders Hosea to go and take her back. It says, "Go love a woman who has a lover and is an adulteress, just as the Lord loves the people of Israel, though they turn to other gods." So when God says, "Lo ruchama," no compassion, in fact, he does have compassion. He says also, "I will have pity on Lo ruchama, and I will say to Lo ami, you are my people, and he shall say, you are my God." So we find here a lot of emotion in this book, that God is repelled and repulsed by Israel's action, but at the same time still loves Israel and does take them back and does restore the relationship. So that it's a book about redemption in a lot of ways. But make sure, if you know about the symbolism, the marriage and the unfaithfulness, and Gomer, and you know that this book is about Israel's unfaithfulness to God through idolatry, you'll know what you need to know for this book. So you don't need to know every detail of these minor prophets. After Hosea comes the book of Joel, and Joel is another one I want you to pay attention to, because Joel deals with natural disaster, a locust plague. So this book we don't know when it was written. Some think it was early, some think it was late. But it is written in response, or he prophesied in response to a locust plague. And locusts are giant grasshoppers. They're not the cicadas, things that around here we call locusts. These are very large grasshoppers, and they, in the developing world, in parts of Africa and the Middle East today, they are still a major problem, because a locust swarm can come through and just devour all the crops. They can cause a famine. They are a major natural disaster. It's not just a nuisance, they are a disaster if a locust plague hits. And that's what has happened to Israel here. And he describes this in some vivid details about how they're almost like an army. In fact, some scholars argue that the locusts here are a metaphor for the invasion of an army. I don't think so. I think it actually is about locusts, and that's the majority perspective, but there are some who think that it's about an army. Some think that it's about both, that first there's a locust plague, and that then serves as sort of a foreshadow for a military invasion from another country. But he describes how they're like a fire. The land before them is like the Garden of Eden, and the land after them is like a smoldering heap. It's like ash, because they just devour everything in sight. And so this book maybe it does call on the people to repent, but it does not say what their sin was. So some of the prophets, most of the prophets actually, are pretty clear about this. It's idolatry, it's social injustice. Those are kind of the two main things. Idolatry, worship of other gods, and social injustice, mistreating the poor, violence, those sorts of things are the major sins that we find in the prophets. Joel does call on the people to repent, but does not ever say what their sin was. So that's a bit unusual as well. It's minor. There's not a lot of focus here on that. Mostly it's describing the invasion and the locusts and whatnot. This book does end with some eschatology. Now, eschatology means things pertaining to the end of time. And we'll deal with this even more in the next video on apocalyptic literature. But I've said that the prophets primarily speak about their own time, not about the distant future. But they do sometimes speak about the future. And that's what we call eschatology. They're talking about the end of the world or the distant future. And Joel has more eschatology than most of the prophets. The last couple chapters or actually the last chapter, Joel chapter 3, but it begins a little bit at the end of chapter 2, describe a future day of judgment, and in ways that anticipate later apocalyptic literature about how the moon will be turned to blood and the sky will be the sun will be darkened in those days. So if you heard anything about this, the blood moons, that yeah, in the past year there's been a few times when the moon had kind of a reddish cast to it. This is where that comes from, and why people associate that with the end of the world. So he talks about some of those cosmic signs, and then about a day of judgment, that God will gather all the nations together and will judge them based on how they treated God's people. And so those nations that were cruel and mistreated Judah and Jerusalem will be punished, and those that were kind to them will be rewarded. So this is sort of one of the first instances we have of sort of the idea of a final judgment, a day of judgment. All right. So that's Joel. It is a short book. Amos is the next book. And if a lot of times I like to, when I'm introducing the prophets in more of a larger class than this, where I have more time, I'll treat Hosea and Amos first, because they are really good examples of kind of the two main paradigms for prophets. Hosea being about idolatry and worship of other gods, breaking the covenant, and Amos focusing on social injustice. So that he's the social justice warrior here. And so that gives you kind of the two poles that most of the prophets are dealing with. Amos was a southern prophet. He's from the land of Judah, and he's not a professional prophet. He's what we call a marginal prophet. Those prophets that are not professionals, that are often persecuted. He's a marginal prophet. Now, Hosea may have been more of a central prophet or a court prophet. It's hard to tell. But Amos is very clearly a marginal prophet. And part of this is he prophesies outside his own land. He's from Judah, but he goes and he prophesies in Israel, in the northern kingdom. So he's an outsider. And he criticizes the king, and the king tells him, hey, go back to Judah, earn your bread there, prophesy there. And Amos's response, he says, I am not a prophet or the son of a prophet. In other words, I'm not a professional. I was he was a shepherd, and he worked in agriculture. He calls himself a dresser of sycamore trees. And he says, I'm not a professional prophet, but God told me to go do this, and so I did it. And the main thing he critiques Israel for is social injustice, for mistreating the poor. And he begins his prophecy with what we call oracles against foreign nations. He speaks these oracles against all these different nations, against Edom and Moab and Ammon and Philistia, critiquing them for their sins, most of which have to do with cruelty and violence toward one another. And then he gets to Judah, and he critiques Judah as well. And then the last one, he ends with an oracle against Israel. And in this oracle, he makes it very clear that the main problem here is that they mistreat the poor. He says, for 3 transgressions of Israel, and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment, because they sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. They who trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth and push the afflicted out of the way. So he's talking about mistreating the poor. He talks about he says they lay themselves down beside every altar on garments taken in pledge. And in the house of their God they drink wine bought with fines they imposed. So this is talking about usury, right? Lending things, or lending money and taking something in pledge, so like a garment. There's actually a law in Deuteronomy that says that if there's a poor person and you lend them money and you take their garment in pledge, you have to give it back to them at night so that they don't freeze to death, so they don't die of exposure. But here it says they're not doing that, right? They're sleeping on the garments and not giving them back. So they're mistreating the poor. And the words here are primarily directed against the wealthy upper class of Israel. And Amos prophesied during a time when Israel was very prosperous. So this book gives you kind of a good example of the social perspective of at least some of the prophets, certainly Amos. Moving on, I don't want to spend too much time on any one of these. So Amos, another one I wanted you to look at is Zephaniah. Zephaniah is a southern prophet right before the Babylonian exile. And Zephaniah is the main thing I want you to get out of Zephaniah is that Zephaniah has a sort of draws on creation imagery a lot. At the beginning of the book, it talks about I will utterly sweep away everything from the face of the earth, says the Lord. I will sweep away humans and animals. I will sweep away the birds of the air and the fish of the sea. I will make the wicked stumble. I will cut off humanity from the face of the earth, says the Lord. And so you notice he includes animals here, right? Nature. But also, if you pay attention to that, the language there is parallel to Genesis 1, right? Humans and animals are created together in Genesis 1 on day 6. Birds of the air and fish of the sea are created together on day 5. So it's sort of going in reverse. In fact, this is the exact reverse order of how things are created in Genesis 1. And it may suggest that what Zephaniah is doing is he's describing uncreation. He's describing the return of the world to sort of a primordial uncreated state. And then another thing here is in the end, in Zephaniah 3, there's an allusion back to the Tower of Babel story in Genesis 11. It says, "At that time I will change the speech of the peoples to a pure speech, that they may call on the name of the Lord and serve him with one accord." When it talks about the pure speech, if you think back to the Tower of Babel story, where there's a mixed up speech, God makes, that at the beginning everyone speaks the same language, but then God mixes up and confuses their language so it's no longer pure. And here that's reversed. So now from the many you have one, created sort of a unity. So I've actually written an article on this, but real quickly just wanted to mention that here we start to see kind of some developments that will anticipate apocalyptic literature later on. This sort of a lot of this creation imagery, the idea of sort of a new heavens and a new earth may be developing here, but reversals and going back to the beginning, going back to creation. Zephaniah is the last of the pre-exilic prophets, so he's looking forward to the exile. The rest of the prophets after Zephaniah, so Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, are all post-exilic. So they're looking back on the exile and rebuilding Judah after the exile. So Haggai is concerned with the rebuilding of the temple. So the issue here in Haggai, and Haggai's in the 6th century, so around the year 520 BC, the people have come back from Babylon, and Haggai says that you have gone off and you have built your own houses, while the house of the Lord lies in ruins. He says, you built your own houses, but you didn't rebuild God's house. He says, my house lies in ruins while all of you hurry off to your own houses. Therefore, the heavens above you have withheld the dew, and the earth has withheld its produce. So the people are experiencing famine and drought. And Haggai says the reason for this is because you have not put the things of God first. You've looked to yourselves. You have not esteemed God. If you put God first and you focus on serving God, if you rebuild the temple, God will open up the heavens and you'll be prosperous. So Haggai's job is to encourage the rebuilding and the restoration of the nation. Another way he does this, aside from encouraging the rebuilding of the temple, is through support for, it seems, the restoration of the Davidic monarchy. Now, it's important to note the monarchy is never restored. The Davidic monarchy does not come back. Now, later on in the 2nd century, there will be another monarchy, the Maccabean dynasty, that's founded, but they are not descendants of David. The Davidic dynasty never comes back. But early on, there were some people who looked like they might reestablish it. In particular, there's a guy named Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel was the grandson of the last king of Judah, and he led some of the Jews back to Jerusalem, and Haggai encourages him and says that God will shake the heavens and the earth, and that he will make Zerubbabel into the signet ring of God. Now, this may be an allusion back to Jeremiah. In Jeremiah, when it was talking about the end of the monarchy and the destruction, the king at that time, Jehoiakim, who was the grandfather of Zerubbabel, God said to Jehoiakim, "I will take your signet ring, and I will give it to the king of Babylon to signify he will lose his power." The signet ring was sort of the symbol of the king's power. He would seal documents with it. And now Zerubbabel is made into God's signet ring. Does that mean he will become king? Now, it doesn't actually say he will become king, but the idea here is that he will, in some sense, embody God's authority on earth. But he does not become king. However, reading just Haggai, you would expect that he probably will. Similar to Haggai is the prophet Zechariah. And Zechariah is a longer book, but falls into two parts. The first 8 chapters are very much parallel to Haggai. They're dealing with the same issues about rebuilding the temple and seemingly maybe the restoration of the Davidic monarchy through Jehoiakim, through Zerubbabel. He also talks a lot about the high priest who serves alongside Zerubbabel. His name is Joshua. Zechariah is interesting in that he's a very vision-oriented prophet. He has a series of what we call night visions. Maybe they're dreams. It seems like maybe they're just visions that occur at night. But he sees all these symbolic visions, things like horses of different colors. So the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse actually originates in Zechariah. He sees things like a flying scroll and a golden lampstand, and these are all symbolic. They represent figures. They represent even people. So, like the lampstand represents, the restoration of the temple. But he has these symbolic visions that he can't understand, and they have to be interpreted for him by an angel. So we call this the interpreting angel. We'll see this more in the book of Daniel, because this becomes one of the main defining characteristics of apocalyptic literature, is what we call mediated revelation. That we see this here we saw it with Ezekiel a little bit, but we see it here especially in Zechariah, that increasingly the prophet is less and less functioning as the mouthpiece of God. Less and less is the prophet actually speaking oracles and saying, "Thus says the Lord." And increasingly, the prophet is a recipient of messages. He sees things and an angel interprets them for him, and he writes them down or he records them in some way. So he's more of a messenger now, or he's more of a recorder, a recipient of revelation than the medium of that revelation. And the angel takes over that job that formerly had been primarily the prophets. So that's the first 8 chapters. Now the last few chapters, chapters 9 through 14, are very apocalyptic in a different way. They have a lot of eschatology, in particular chapters 12 through 14, where there's, again, it's like Joel, there's a final battle. People are gathered together to fight against Jerusalem, and God himself shows up and defeats the enemies of Israel. So it says actually that when that he descends from heaven, and when his foot touches the Mount of Olives, which is a mountain right across from Jerusalem, it splits in two. And there's a plague that comes upon the people. Their flesh rots off of their bodies while they're standing there. It's kind of like the final scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark, if you've seen that. So this is like the day. This is like Revelation. This is Day of Judgment. So again, a very apocalyptic feature here. So what we find in the post-exilic period is that the prophets become much more apocalyptic, much more focused on eschatology, on the future, on the Day of Judgment, and things like that. We're transitioning now from prophecy, from classical prophecy, into apocalypticism. And then finally, the prophet Malachi. This is the last of the prophets. And Malachi, a little bit later even than Zechariah and Haggai, they're in the 6th century. Malachi is in the mid-5th century, so the temple has been rebuilt and is functioning, because one of the things that Malachi deals with is criticizing the people, and in particular the priests, for offering throwaway animals. They're offering animals as sacrifices that are impure. They are blind, they are lame, they are tainted in some way. And if you go back to Leviticus, if you were so inclined, sacrificial animals were supposed to be pure. They were supposed to be spotless. They were supposed to be without defect. They are not doing that. They're giving God the animals that they don't want, giving God their throwaways. And so he critiques them for that. He says, hey, try doing that with your governor. The Persians are still in power here. So they have governors. He says, try offering an animal like that to your governor and see what happens. Will he be pleased? No. So why would you give God something that is less than your best? He deals a lot with the covenant as well. Issues that we saw in Ezra and Nehemiah about marriage to foreigners. He says that they've been marrying foreign women, and they need to stop that. They're being unfaithful to the covenant with God. Repeating some of the same mistakes that caused the exile in the first place. He also gets into the development of what we call messianism. You'll notice that in the Old Testament we haven't really talked much about the Messiah. You get to the New Testament and it's all about the Messiah. Jesus is the Messiah. The Messiah is hinted at in the Old Testament, but it's something that develops over time. It's all kind of rooted in the Davidic covenant, the everlasting king that's supposed to come from David. But we start to see some of that expectation that the Messiah is coming in Malachi. So he says, I am sending my messenger to prepare the way before me. And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come into his temple. Now, is the messenger the Messiah? In the New Testament, the messenger is treated as someone who comes before the Messiah, as a forerunner, and is identified as John the Baptist. Because he goes to prepare the way before the Lord. In the New Testament, that's understood as the messenger who comes before the Messiah. Malachi says more about that. He says that he actually identifies who the messenger is. He says, I will send you the prophet Elijah before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes. And so this is why in the New Testament there are a few places in the Gospels where people are questioning to Jesus, why do we say that Elijah is supposed to come first and Elijah hasn't come? And Jesus says, well, he did kind of come. Elijah, or John the Baptist was like Elijah. He was reminiscent of Elijah. And so he's sort of a new Elijah. But this is a tradition in Jewish messianism that Elijah would come and announce that the Messiah was coming. So that's a real quick overview of some of the more important of the minor prophets that I want you to be aware of. Again, make sure you've done the reading. What I've done here is not certainly to exhaust what you should get out of these books. So make sure you do the reading of these books and also the companion reading from the Longman book. And we're just about done. We've got one more video to do on apocalyptic literature and the book of Daniel, and that will conclude our journey through the Old Testament. So the final exam is up now and available for you to take. Make sure you get that done by the end of week 8.